Hi everyone, welcome back. We've got a brand new story to share with you. So let's begin. My name is Martin, and nothing could have prepared me for the day my 16-year-old daughter told me she wished I were dead. What started as a simple phone call about birthday gifts turned into a moment that shattered everything I thought I knew about our relationship and forced me to make one of the hardest parenting decisions of my life. To understand how we got to that point, I'll have to take you back many years when my marriage to Linda, her daughter's mother, started falling apart. We'd been married for 10 years and had our daughter Ruby when things in our household became increasingly tense and unstable. I was working as an accountant for a mid-sized firm trying to build my career and provide for my family, but we started struggling financially after a few years. Linda worked part-time as a pharmacy technician, but her hours were irregular and the pay wasn't enough to make a real difference in our budget. We were struggling with credit card debt, a mortgage that was becoming harder to manage, and the general expenses that come with raising a child. The stress of our financial situation started affecting every aspect of our marriage. I was working longer hours, trying to take on additional clients and projects to bring in more money. This meant I was home less, which Linda hated, even though she knew I was doing it for our family's financial survival. She complained that I was never around, that Ruby barely saw her father, and that I was choosing work over family time. It was the same lecture every single day. She started acting like I was doing it intentionally, like I wanted to stay away from home and my own daughter. But the reality was that I didn't have much choice. We were behind on several bills, our credit was suffering, and I was constantly worried about how we were going to make ends meet. I felt like I was failing as a provider, and Linda's complaints about my absence only made that feeling worse. I was caught in an impossible situation where working more meant being away from family, but working less meant we couldn't pay our bills. Around this time, I started noticing changes in Linda's behavior that made me uncomfortable. She was spending more time away from home, claiming she was out with friends or running errands that seemed to take much longer than they should have. She'd get secretive about phone calls and texts, stepping into another room or waiting until I wasn't around to respond to messages. Linda also started paying more attention to her appearance. She was buying new clothes we couldn't really afford, getting her hair done more frequently, and was more concerned about how she looked when she left the house than she had been in years. When I'd ask about these changes, she'd get defensive and say she deserved to feel good about herself. But I still had my doubts. The distance between us grew more and more as months passed. Linda became more critical of everything I did, more resentful about our financial situation, and less interested in working together to solve our problems. Instead of feeling like we were a team facing challenges together, it felt like she was blaming me for all of our difficulties and looking elsewhere for happiness. Ruby was 9 years old during this period, old enough to sense the tension in our house, but too young to really understand what was happening between her parents. She'd ask why Mommy and Daddy were always upset with each other, or why I was working so much. I tried to reassure her that everything would be okay, but it was hard to sound convincing when I wasn't sure that was true. The truth about Linda's affair came out in the most painful way possible. I discovered text messages on her phone that made it clear she'd been seeing someone else for months. The messages were intimate, romantic, and included planning to end our marriage and be with the new guy. When I confronted Linda about what I'd found, she initially tried to deny it, then minimize it, and finally got angry at me for snooping through her phone. She said she wouldn't have looked elsewhere if I'd been a better husband and father, if I'd been home more, if I'd paid more attention to her needs. She turned the conversation around to make me feel like her affair was somehow my fault. That's the moment when I realized that our marriage was over. The combination of financial stress, her infidelity, and the complete breakdown of trust and communication between us made it impossible to continue. I told Linda I wanted a divorce, and she said she'd been thinking the same thing. What I didn't expect was how ugly the divorce process would become. I wanted things to end between us as peacefully as possible, but that's not what happened. Linda hired an aggressive divorce attorney and came at me with every accusation she could think of. She claimed I was an absent father who cared more about work than my daughter. She said I was emotionally unavailable and had created a hostile home environment. She downplayed her affair, claiming it was just emotional support she wanted, because I was such a poor husband. The divorce proceedings dragged on for over a year, with constant court dates, mediation sessions, and legal bills that I could barely afford. Linda was fighting for primary custody of Ruby, substantial alimony, and as much of our shared assets as she could get. Her strategy seemed to be to paint me as an unfit father and husband who deserved to lose everything. During this time, Ruby was living primarily with Linda and spending very little time with me. I could see that Linda was influencing how Ruby thought about the divorce and about me. Ruby would come to my apartment for visits and repeat things that Linda had obviously told her about why Mommy and Daddy were getting divorced, always with me as the villain in the story. Every time I think deeply about everything that's happening, I feel an ache that never goes away. I'd replay conversations in my mind, wondering if I could have said something differently, done more to bridge the gap. My nights were the hardest. I would be lying awake thinking about my little girl growing more distant, while feeling like a stranger in her life. It hurts realizing that my years of effort could be erased by someone else's influence. The helplessness screamed at me, leaving me exhausted not just physically, but emotionally. I wanted to protect her from all the toxicity, shield her from lies, but I couldn't fight her mother's influence alone. It was a quiet kind of pain that nobody could see, but it was real and persistent, shaping every decision I made as a father. It was heartbreaking to watch my 9-year-old daughter start to see me through her mother's bitter lens. Ruby would ask why I'd been mean to Mommy, or why I didn't love our family enough to stay together. I tried to explain things in age-appropriate ways, but it was hard for me as well. The constant negative messaging from the primary parent without sounding defensive or like you're criticizing the child's mother. When the divorce was finally finalized, Linda got primary custody of Ruby, as I'd feared she would. The court ordered me to pay substantial child support, which I was willing to do because I wanted Ruby to be taken care of. I was granted visitation rights that allowed Ruby to spend some weekends and holidays with me, though it wasn't as much time as I'd hoped for. What made the custody arrangement even more painful was discovering that Linda was now living with the man she'd been having an affair with during our marriage. Ruby was being raised by her mother and this other man, while I was reduced to the role of weekend visitor who sent checks every month. It broke my heart more than anything. For me, the marriage ending with Linda wasn't as painful as not having Ruby with me. After the divorce was finalized, I threw myself into rebuilding my financial stability and career. I'd lost a lot of money during the divorce proceedings, and I needed to focus on getting back on solid ground so I could provide for Ruby properly and eventually rebuild my life. I avoided dating or relationships entirely, putting all my energy into work and the limited time I had with my daughter. About 2 years after our divorce, I learned through mutual friends that Linda's relationship with her affair partner had ended. Apparently, it had become abusive, and Linda had finally left him. I felt bad for Ruby having to witness that kind of relationship, but I also wasn't surprised that someone who would help break up a marriage might not be the most stable or trustworthy partner. Linda started reaching out to me during this period, trying to be friendlier and more cooperative about custody, arrangements, and communication. I think she was hoping we could rebuild some kind of relationship, possibly even romantic, now that her other relationship had failed. But I'd moved on emotionally from our marriage, and I wasn't interested in reopening those wounds. When I didn't respond to Linda's attempts to warm our relationship, she became resentful again. A few months later, she took me back to court, claiming that the child support I was paying was not enough for Ruby's needs. She argued that my income had increased since the divorce, and that Ruby deserved more financial support from her father. The court evaluated my financial situation and determined that I was already paying appropriate child support based on the guidelines and my income. Linda's claim was dismissed, which seemed to make her even more angry and hateful towards me. She'd lost her attempt to get more money, and she'd been rejected in her efforts to reconcile our relationship. This is when Linda really ramped up her campaign to turn Ruby against me. Ruby, who was now in her early teens, started declining to spend time with me during my scheduled visitation. She'd claim she was too busy with friends or activities, or she'd say she didn't want to be around me, because I was mean to her mother. When Ruby would spend time with me, she'd be distant and sometimes hostile. She'd repeat accusations about how I'd treated Linda during our marriage, things she was obviously hearing at home. She'd say I was selfish for not giving her mother more money, and that I didn't really care about her because I didn't visit more often, ignoring the fact that Linda had limited my visitation rights through the court. She wouldn't let me hug her or be a true father to her because of all the poison her mother had filled her mind with about me. I tried to explain my side of things to Ruby without bad-mouthing her mother or going into inappropriate details about adult relationship issues. I'd tell her that divorce was complicated, that both parents had made mistakes, and that my love for her had never changed, even if my marriage to her mother hadn't worked out. But it was clear that my voice was being drowned out by constant negative messaging at home. Even with Ruby's increasingly cold treatment of me, I continued to provide for her beyond just the court-mandated child support. I'd send her gifts for special occasions, help pay for school activities and clothes, and try to be involved in her life far more than the custody arrangement allowed. I hoped that my consistent presence and support would eventually overcome whatever poison her mother was feeding her about me. Ruby's 16th birthday was coming up, and I wanted to make it special despite our complex relationship. I asked her what she wanted for her birthday, and she gave me a small list of items, some clothes, a few books, and a piece of jewelry she'd been wanting. Instead of just getting those things, I decided to go far beyond what she'd requested. I bought everything on her list plus additional gifts I thought she'd enjoy. I got her really expensive versions of the clothes she'd asked for, additional books by authors I knew she liked, and a much more expensive piece of jewelry than what she'd originally wanted. I also included gift cards for stores she shopped at and money for activities with her friends. The total cost was probably 3 times what she'd requested, but I wanted to show her how much I loved her. I sent all the gifts to Linda's house with a card expressing how proud I was of Ruby and how much I loved her. I hoped that such a generous and thoughtful gesture might help rebuild some of the connection between us that had been damaged by years of her mother's negative influence. But Ruby never acknowledged receiving the gifts. No thank you call, no text message, not even a brief acknowledgement that the packages had arrived. It was like I'd sent nothing at all. This hurt more than I expected because I'd put a lot of thought and money into trying to make her birthday special, and it seemed like she didn't care at all. After about a week of waiting for some kind of response, I decided to call Ruby directly. I wanted to know if she liked the gifts, and I also wanted to hear her voice. But when I called, she didn't answer. I tried several more times over the next few days, leaving voicemails asking her to call me back, but she continued to ignore my calls. Finally, after several days of trying to reach her, Ruby answered the phone. But instead of a normal greeting, she immediately asked what I wanted in a tone that was cold and impatient. Her attitude caught me off guard, and I told her that there was no way to speak to her father. What happened next was something I never could have prepared for. Ruby exploded in anger, screaming at me through the phone in a way that was shocking and hurtful. She yelled that she wished I were dead, that I was a terrible father, and that her mother's new boyfriend was her real dad. She said she didn't want my gifts, my money, or anything to do with me. I was shocked into silence. This was my daughter, the little girl I'd read bedtime stories to and taught to ride a bike, telling me she wished I were dead and rejecting me completely in favor of some man her mother was dating. I had no idea Linda even had a new boyfriend, let alone that this man had become such an important figure in Ruby's life. The pain of hearing my daughter say she wished I was dead was terrible. But what hurt almost as much was realizing how completely Linda had poisoned Ruby's mind against me. This wasn't just teenage rebellion or normal father-daughter conflict. This was the result of years of deliberate manipulation designed to make Ruby hate me and see me as the enemy. After Ruby finished screaming at me, I took a deep breath and said simply, "Noted, sweetheart," then ended the call. I didn't argue with her, didn't try to defend myself, and didn't lose my temper in response to her cruelty. But inside, I was devastated and angry and hurt beyond words. That night, I made a decision that was probably the hardest parenting choice I'd ever made. If Ruby wanted to treat me like I was dead, then I would give her that experience. I decided to stop going above and beyond in my support for her to stop sending the extra gifts and money and gestures that she clearly didn't appreciate. From that day forward, I sent only exactly what the court had mandated for child support. Nothing more, nothing less. No surprise gifts or presents, no extra money for activities, no clothing allowances, no help with school expenses beyond what was legally required. If Ruby wanted to pretend her mother's boyfriend was her real father, then she could see what it was like to depend on him for all the extras I'd been providing. I also stopped reaching out to Ruby directly. No more phone calls trying to connect with her, no more text messages asking about school or friends, no more attempts to maintain a relationship with someone who had told me she wished I were dead. I began acting exactly as dead to her as she'd said she wanted me to be. The change was immediate and dramatic. Within 3 weeks of my withdrawing all extra support, Ruby was calling and texting me. At first, her messages were still somewhat hostile, asking why I wasn't sending her the money and gifts I used to send. But when I didn't respond to any of her attempts to contact me, her tone began to change. Ruby started leaving voicemails that sounded confused and concerned. She'd ask if I was okay, if something had happened to me, if I was mad at her. But I ignored all of these attempts at communication. She told me she wished I were dead and that another man was her real father. So I was giving her exactly what she'd said she wanted. For 2 months, I maintained complete silence despite Ruby's increasingly desperate attempts to reach me. Her messages went from hostile to confused to worried to genuinely concerned. She started asking Linda to contact me. But I told Linda that all communication needed to go through lawyers unless it was an emergency involving Ruby's health or safety. The breakthrough came when Ruby finally left a voicemail that showed she was beginning to understand what she'd lost. She talked about missing the things I used to send her, missing our conversations, and realizing how much I'd been doing for her that she'd taken for granted. She sounded genuinely sorry and scared that she'd permanently damaged our relationship. After 2 months and some weeks of silence, I finally called Ruby back. When she answered, she immediately started crying and apologizing for what she'd said to me. She said she'd been confused and angry about the divorce, and that her mother had been telling her things about me that made her think I was the bad guy in everything that had happened. Ruby admitted that when I stopped providing all the extra support I'd been giving her, she realized how much I'd been sacrificing to make her life comfortable. She said her mother's new boyfriend wasn't contributing nearly as much as I had been, and that she'd started to see the difference between someone who was just dating her mother and someone who was truly committed to being her father. We had a long conversation about the divorce, about my love for her, and about the mistakes we'd both made in our relationship. I explained that I'd never stopped loving her, but that I wouldn't tolerate being treated with cruelty and disrespect. I told her that wishing death on someone who loved her was unacceptable, and that claiming another man was her real father had been deeply hurtful. Ruby apologized sincerely for her words and her behavior. She said she understood now that I'd been trying to be a good father despite the difficult circumstances of the divorce, and that she'd let her mother's bitterness influence her too much. She asked if we could start over and try to rebuild our relationship. In that moment, I realized parenting isn't just about providing for your children or being there when they need you. It's about teaching respect, boundaries, and accountability. Sometimes the hardest lessons are the ones you have to teach through absence rather than presence. Being a father means making decisions that hurt in the short term, but protect the long-term well-being of your child. I had to accept that love sometimes looks like stepping back, letting my daughter face the consequences of her choices, and trusting that she could learn and grow from them. It was painful, but I also knew that if I hadn't set these boundaries, our relationship might never have recovered. I forgave Ruby because she's my daughter and I love her unconditionally. But I also made it clear that our relationship moving forward would be different. I would continue to support her as her father, but I expected to be treated with respect and kindness. I wouldn't tolerate being screamed at, having my love questioned, or being compared unfavorably to her mother's boyfriends. Ruby agreed to these terms, and slowly we began rebuilding our connection. She started spending her scheduled visitation time with me again, and our conversations became warmer and more genuine. She also became more critical of her mother's attempts to turn her against me, recognizing the manipulation for what it was. The experience taught me that sometimes tough love is the most loving thing you can do for a child. By withdrawing my extra support and attention when Ruby treated me cruelly, I forced her to confront the reality of what she was throwing away. If I'd continued to absorb her abuse and keep providing for her regardless of how she treated me, she never would have learned to value our relationship. I also learned that divorce situations involving children are incredibly complex, and that one parent can significantly damage the child's relationship with the other parent through manipulation and poisoning. Linda had spent years convincing Ruby that I was the villain in our family story, and it took Ruby experiencing real consequences to see through those lies. Ruby is now 17, and our relationship is stronger than it's been since the divorce. She's more mature in her understanding of what happened between her parents, and she's more appreciative of the sacrifices I've made to be present in her life despite the challenges. She's also more skeptical of her mother's attempts to manipulate her perceptions of our family history. The 2 months plus I spent acting dead to Ruby were among the hardest of my life as a father. Every instinct told me to reach out, to fix things, to try to explain myself, and win back her affection. But sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is show someone what life would be like without you, especially when they've been taking your presence and love for granted. Ruby learned that having a real father who loves you and provides for you is different from having your mother's temporary boyfriend play a parental role. She learned that the parent who sets boundaries and expects respectful treatment might actually love you more than the parent who lets you do whatever you want. And she learned that words have consequences, especially cruel words directed at people who love you. I'm grateful that Ruby was mature enough to recognize her mistakes and work to repair our relationship. Not every story like this has a happy ending, but I'm also glad I had the strength to withdraw my support when she treated me with such cruelty, because it ultimately saved our relationship by forcing her to confront reality.